Chapter 7 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. The Schoolmaster's Bride. "Who was the first bride who came to this house, Captain Jim?" Anne asked as they sat around the fireplace after supper. "Was she part of the story I've heard was connected with this house?" asked Gilbert. "Somebody told me you could tell it, Captain Jim." "Well, yes, I know it. I reckon I'm the only person living in Four Winds now that can remember the schoolmaster's bride, as she was when she came to the island. She's been dead this 30 year, but she was one of them women you never forget." "Tell us the story," pleaded Anne. "I want to find out all about the women who have lived in this house before me." "Well, there's just been 3. Elizabeth Russell, and Mrs. Ned Russell, and the schoolmaster's bride. Elizabeth Russell was a nice, clever little critter, and Mrs. Ned was a nice woman, too, but they weren't ever like the schoolmaster's bride. The schoolmaster's name was John Selwyn. He came out from the old country to teach school at the Glen when I was a boy of 16. He wasn't much like the usual run of derelicts who used to come out to PEI to teach school in them days. Most of them were clever, drunken critters who taught the children the 3 R's when they were sober and lambasted them when they wasn't. But John Selwyn was a fine, handsome young fella. He boarded at my father's, and he and me were cronies, though he was 10 years older than me. We read and walked and talked a heap together. He knew about all the poetry that was ever written, I reckon, and he used to quote it to me along the shore in the evenings. Dad thought it an awful waste of time, but he sorter endured it, hoping it'd put me off the notion of going to sea. Well, nothing could do that. Mother came of a race of sea-going folk, and it was born in me. But I loved to hear John read and recite. It's almost 60 years ago, but I could repeat yards of poetry I learned from him. Nearly 60 years. Captain Jim was silent for a space, gazing into the glowing fire in a quest of the bygones. Then, with a sigh, he resumed his story. "I remember one spring evening I met him on the sandhills. He looked sort of uplifted, just like you did, Dr. Blythe, when you brought Mistress Blythe in tonight. I thought of him the minute I seen you, and he told me that he had a sweetheart back home and that she was coming out to him. I wasn't more'n half pleased, ornery young lump of selfishness that I was. I thought he wouldn't be as much my friend after she came. But I'd decency enough not to let him see it. He told me all about her. Her name was Persis Lee, and she would have come out with him if it hadn't been for her old uncle. He was sick, and he'd looked after her when her parents died and she wouldn't leave him. And now he was dead, and she was coming out to marry John Selwyn. 'Twas a no easy journey for a woman in them days. There weren't no steamers, you must recollect. 'When d'ye expect her?' says I. 'She sails on the Royal William the 20th of June,' says he, 'and so she should be here by mid-July. I must set Carpenter Johnson to building me a home for her. Her letter came today. I knew before I opened it that it had good news for me. I saw her a few nights ago.' I didn't understand him, and then he explained, though I didn't understand that much better. He said he had a gift or a curse. Them was his words, Mistress Blythe, a gift or a curse. He didn't know which it was. He said a great-great-grandmother of his had it, and they burned her for a witch on account of it. He said queer spells, trances, I think was the name he give 'em, come over him now and again. Are there such things, Doctor?" "There are people who are certainly subject to trances," answered Gilbert. "The matter is more in the line of psychical research than medical. What were the trances of this John Selwyn like?" "Like dreams," said the old doctor skeptically. "He said he could see things in them," said Captain Jim slowly. "Mind you, I'm telling you just what he said, things that were happening, things that were going to happen. He said they were sometimes a comfort to him and sometimes a horror. 4 nights before this he'd been in one, went into it while he was sitting looking at the fire, and he saw an old room he knew well in England, and Persis Lee in it, holding out her hands to him and looking glad and happy, so he knew he was going to hear good news of her." A dream," scoffed the old doctor. Likely, conceded Captain Jim. "That's what I said to him at the time. It was a vast more comfortable to think so. I didn't like the idea of him seeing things like that. It was real uncanny. 'Nope,' says he, 'I didn't dream it. But we won't talk of this again. You won't be so much my friend if you think much about it.' I told him nothing could make me any less his friend. But he just shook his head and says he, 'Lad, I know. I've lost friends before because of this. I don't blame 'em. There are times when I feel hardly friendly to myself because of it. Such a power has a bit of divinity in it, whether of a good or an evil divinity, who shall say? And we mortals all shrink from too close contact with God or devil. Them was his words. I remember them as if 'twas yesterday, though I didn't know just what he meant. What do you suppose he did mean, Doctor?" "I doubt if he knew what he meant himself," said Dr. Dave testily. "I think I understand," whispered Anne. She was listening in her old attitude of clasped lips and shining eyes. Captain Jim treated himself to an admiring smile before he went on with his story. "Well, pretty soon all the Glen and Four Winds people knew the schoolmaster's bride was coming, and they were all glad because they thought so much of him. And everybody took an interest in his new house, this house. He picked this site for it because you could see the harbor and hear the sea from it. He made the garden out there for his bride, but he didn't plant the Lombardies. Mrs. Ned Russell planted them. But there's a double row of rose bushes in the garden that the little girls who went to the Glen school set out there for the schoolmaster's bride. He said they were pink for her cheeks, and white for her brow, and red for her lips. He'd quoted poetry so much that he sort of got into the habit of talking it, too, I reckon. Almost everybody sent him some little present to help out the furnishing of the house. When the Russells came into it, they were well-to-do and furnished it real handsome, as you can see. But the first furniture that went into it was plain enough. This little house was rich in love, though. The women sent in quilts and tablecloths and towels, and one man made a chest for her, and another a table, and so on. Even blind old Aunt Margaret Boyd wove a little basket for her out of the sweet-scented sandhill grass. The schoolmaster's wife used it for years to keep her handkerchiefs in. Well, at last everything was ready, even to the logs in the big fireplace ready for lighting. 'Twasn't exactly this fireplace, though 'twas in the same place. Miss Elizabeth had this put in when she made the house over 15 years ago. It was a big, old-fashioned fireplace where you could have roasted an ox. Many's the time I've sat here and spun yarns, same's I'm doing tonight." Again there was a silence while Captain Jim kept a passing tryst with visitants Anne and Gilbert could not see, the folks who had sat with him around that fireplace in the vanished years, with mirth and bridal joy shining in eyes long since closed forever under churchyard sod or heaving leagues of sea. Here on olden nights children had tossed laughter lightly to and fro. Here on winter evenings friends had gathered. Dance and music and jest had been here. Here youths and maidens had dreamed. For Captain Jim the little house was tenanted with shapes entreating remembrance. It was the 1st of July when the house was finished. The schoolmaster began to count the days then. We used to see him walking along the shore, and we'd say to each other, "She'll soon be with him now." She was expected the middle of July, but she didn't come then. Nobody felt anxious. Vessels were often delayed for days and maybe weeks. The Royal William was a week overdue, and then 2, and then 3, and at last we began to be frightened, and it got worse and worse. Finally I couldn't bear to look into John Selwyn's eyes. "D'you know, Mistress Blythe," Captain Jim lowered his voice, "I used to think that they looked just like what his old great-great-grandmothers must have been when they were burning her to death. He never said much, but he taught school like a man in a dream, and then hurried to the shore. Many a night he walked there from dark to dawn. People said he was losing his mind. Everybody had given up hope. The Royal William was 8 weeks overdue. It was the middle of September, and the schoolmaster's bride hadn't come. Never would come, we thought. There was a big storm then that lasted 3 days, and on the evening after it died away I went to the shore. I found the schoolmaster there, leaning with his arms folded against a big rock, gazing out to sea. I spoke to him, but he didn't answer. His eyes seemed to be looking at something I couldn't see. His face was set like a dead man's. "John, John," I called out, just like that, just like a frightened child. "Wake up, wake up." That strange, awful look seemed to sort of fade out of his eyes. He turned his head and looked at me. I have never forgot his face, never will forget it till I ships for my last voyage. "All is well, lad," he says. "I've seen the Royal William coming around East Point. She'll be here by dawn. Tomorrow night I shall sit with my bride by my own hearth fire." "Do you think he did see it?" demanded Captain Jim abruptly. "God knows," said Gilbert softly. Great love and great pain might compass we know not what marvels." "I am sure he did see it," said Anne earnestly. "Fol de rol," said Dr. Dave, but he spoke with less conviction than usual. "Because you know," said Captain Jim solemnly, "the Royal William came into Four Winds Harbor at daylight the next morning. Every soul in the glen and along the shore was at the old wharf to meet her. The schoolmaster had been watching there all night. How we cheered as she sailed up the channel." Captain Jim's eyes were shining. They were looking at the Four Winds Harbor of 60 years agone, with a battered old ship sailing through the sunrise splendor. "And Persis Leigh was on board?" asked Anne. "Yes, her and the captain's wife. They'd had an awful passage, storm after storm, and their provisions give out, too. But there they were at last. When Persis Leigh stepped onto the old wharf, John Selwyn took her in his arms, and folks stopped cheering and begun to cry. I cried myself, though 'twas years, mind you, afore I'd admitted. Ain't it funny how ashamed boys are of tears?" "Was Persis Leigh beautiful?" asked Anne. "Well, I don't know that you'd call her beautiful exactly. I don't know," said Captain Jim slowly. "Somehow you never got so far along as to wonder if she was handsome or not. It just didn't matter. There was something so sweet and winsome about her that you had to love her. That was all. But she was pleasant to look at. Big, clear, hazel eyes and heaps of glossy brown hair, and an English skin. John and her were married at our house that night at early candle lighting. Everybody from far and near was there to see it, and we all brought them down here afterwards. Mistress Selwyn lighted the fire, and we went away and left them sitting here, just as John had seen in that vision of his. A strange thing, a strange thing. But I've seen a terrible lot of strange things in my time." Captain Jim shook his head sagely. "It's a dear story," said Anne, feeling that for once she had got enough romance to satisfy her. "How long did they live here?" 15 years. I ran off to sea soon after they were married, like the young scalawag I was. But every time I come back from a voyage I'd head for here, even before I went home, and tell Mistress Selwyn all about it. 15 happy years. They had a sort of talent for happiness, them two. Some folks are like that, if you've noticed. They couldn't be unhappy for long, no matter what happened. They quarreled once or twice, for they was both high-spirited. But Mistress Selwyn says to me once, says she, laughing in that pretty way of hers, 'I felt dreadful when John and I quarreled, but underneath it all I was very happy because I had such a nice husband to quarrel with and make it up with.' Then they moved to Charlottetown, and Ned Russell bought this house and brought his bride here. They were a gay young pair as I remember them. Miss Elizabeth Russell was Alec's sister. She came to live with them a year or so later, and she was a creature of mirth, too. The walls of this house must be sort of soaked with laughing and good times. You're the third bride I've seen come here, Mistress Blythe, and the handsomest." Captain Jim contrived to give his sunflower compliment the delicacy of a violet, and Anne wore it proudly. She was looking her best that night, with the bridal rose on her cheeks and the love light in her eyes. Even gruff old Dr. Dave gave her an approving glance, and told his wife, as they drove home together, that red-headed wife of the boys was something of a beauty. "I must be getting back to the light," announced Captain Jim. "I've enjoyed this evening something tremendous." "You must come often to see us," said Anne. "I wonder if you'd give that invitation if you knew how likely I'll be to accept it," Captain Jim remarked whimsically. "Which is another way of saying you wonder if I mean it," smiled Anne. "I do. Cross my heart, as we used to say at school." "Then I'll come. You're likely to be pestered with me at any hour, and I'll be proud to have you drop down and visit me now and then, too. Generally I haven't anyone to talk to but the first mate, bless his sociable heart. He's a mighty good listener, and has forgot more'n any McAllister of them all ever knew. But he isn't much of a conversationalist. You're young and I'm old, but our souls are about the same age, I reckon. We both belong to the race that knows Joseph, as Cornelia Bryant would say." "The race that knows Joseph?" puzzled Anne. "Yes, Cornelia divides all the folks in the world into two kinds, the race that knows Joseph and the race that don't. If a person sort of sees eye to eye with you and has pretty much the same ideas about things and the same taste in jokes, why, then he belongs to the race that knows Joseph." "Oh, I understand," exclaimed Anne, light breaking in upon her. "It's what I used to call, and still call in quotation marks, kindred spirits." "Just so," agreed Captain Jim. "We're it, whatever it is. When you come in tonight, Mistress Blythe, I says to myself, says I, yes, she's of the race that knows Joseph. And mighty glad I was, for if it wasn't so we couldn't have had any real satisfaction in each other's company. The race that knows Joseph is the salt of the earth, I reckon." The moon had just risen when Anne and Gilbert went to the door with their guests. Four Winds Harbor was beginning to be a thing of dream and glamour and enchantment, a spellbound haven where no tempest might ever raven. The Lombardys down the lane, tall and somber as the priestly forms of some mystic band, were tipped with silver. "Always liked Lombardys," said Captain Jim, waving a long arm at them. "They're the trees of princesses. They're out of fashion now. Folks complain that they die at the top and get ragged looking. So they do, if you don't risk your neck every spring climbing up a light ladder to trim them out. I always did it for Miss Elizabeth, so her Lombardys never got out at elbows. She was especially fond of them. She liked their dignity and standoffishness. They don't hobnob with every Tom, Dick, and Harry. If it's maples for company, Mistress Blythe, it's Lombardys for society." "What a beautiful night," said Mrs. Dr. Dave as she climbed into the doctor's buggy. "Most nights are beautiful," said Captain Jim, "but I 'low that moonlight over Four Winds makes me sort of wonder what's left for heaven. The moon's a great friend of mine, Mistress Blythe. I've loved her ever since I can remember. When I was a little chap of 8 I fell asleep in the garden one evening and wasn't missed. I woke up along in the night and I was most scared to death. What shadows and queer noises there was. I dursn't move. Just crouched there quaking, poor small mite. Seemed as if there weren't anyone in the world but myself, and it was mighty big. Then all at once I saw the moon looking down at me through the apple boughs, just like an old friend. I was comforted right off. Got up and walked to the house as brave as a lion, looking at her. Many's the night I've watched her from the deck of my vessel on seas far away from here. Why don't you folks tell me to take in the slack of my jaw and go home?" The laughter of the good nights died away. Anne and Gilbert walked hand in hand around their garden. The brook that ran across the corner dimpled pellucidly in the shadows of the birches. The poppies along its banks were like shallow cups of moonlight. Flowers that had been planted by the hands of the schoolmaster's bride flung their sweetness on the shadowy air, like the beauty and blessing of sacred yesterdays. Anne paused in the gloom to gather a spray. "I love to smell flowers in the dark," she said. "You get hold of their soul then. Oh, Gilbert, this little house is all I've dreamed it, and I'm so glad that we are not the first to have kept bridal tryst here." End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Miss Cornelia Bryant Comes to Call. That month of September was a month of golden mists and purple hazes at Four Winds Harbor, a month of sun-steeped days and of nights that were swimming in moonlight or pulsating with stars. No storm marred it, no rough wind blew. Anne and Gilbert put their nest in order, rambled on the shores, sailed on the harbor, drove about Four Winds in the glen or through the ferny, sequestered roads of the woods around the harbor head. In short, had such a honeymoon as any lovers in the world might have envied them. If life were to stop short just now, it would still have been richly worthwhile, just for the sake of these past 4 weeks, wouldn't it? Said Anne. I don't suppose we will ever have 4 such perfect weeks again, but we've had them. Everything, wind, weather, folks, House of Dreams, has conspired to make our honeymoon delightful. There hasn't even been a rainy day since we came here. And we haven't quarreled once, teased Gilbert. Well, that's a pleasure all the greater for being deferred, quoted Anne. I'm so glad we decided to spend our honeymoon here. Our memories of it will always belong here, in our House of Dreams, instead of being scattered about in strange places. There was a certain tang of romance and adventure in the atmosphere of their new home, which Anne had never found in Avonlea. There, although she had lived in sight of the sea, it had not entered intimately into her life. In Four Winds it surrounded her and called to her constantly. From every window of her new home she saw some varying aspect of it. Its haunting murmur was ever in her ears. Vessels sailed up the harbor every day to the wharf at the Glen, or sailed out again through the sunset, bound for ports that might be halfway around the globe. Fishing boats went white-winged down the channel in the mornings and returned laden in the evenings. Sailors and fisher-folk traveled the red, winding harbor roads, light-hearted and content. There was always a certain sense of things going to happen, of adventures and farings forth. The ways of Four Winds were less staid and settled and grooved than those of Avonlea. Winds of change blew over them, the sea called ever to the dwellers on shore, and even those who might not answer its call felt the thrill and unrest and mystery and possibilities of it. "I understand now why some men must go to sea," said Anne. "That desire which comes to us all at times, to sail beyond the bourne of sunset, must be very imperious when it is born in you. I don't wonder Captain Jim ran away because of it. I never see a ship sailing out of the channel, or a gull soaring over the sandbar, without wishing I were on board the ship or had wings, not like a dove to fly away and be at rest, but like a gull to sweep out into the very heart of a storm." "You'll stay right here with me, Anne girl," said Gilbert lazily. "I won't have you flying away from me into the hearts of storms." They were sitting on their red sandstone doorstep in the late afternoon. Great tranquillities were all about them in land and sea and sky. Silvery gulls were soaring over them. The horizons were laced with long trails of frail, pinkish clouds. The hushed air was threaded with a murmurous refrain of minstrel winds and waves. Pale asters were blowing in the sere and misty meadows between them and the harbor. "Doctors who have to be up all night waiting on sick folk don't feel very adventurous, I suppose," Anne said indulgently. "If you had had a good sleep last night, Gilbert, you'd be as ready as I am for a flight of imagination." "I did good work last night, Anne," said Gilbert quietly. "Under God, I saved a life. This is the first time I could ever really claim that. In other cases I may have helped, but Anne, if I had not stayed at Allenby's last night and fought death hand to hand, that woman would have died before morning. I tried an experiment that was certainly never tried in Four Winds before. I doubt if it was ever tried anywhere before outside of a hospital. It was a new thing in Kingsport Hospital last winter. I could never have dared try it here if I had not been absolutely certain that there was no other chance. I risked it, and it succeeded. As a result, a good wife and mother is saved for long years of happiness and usefulness. As I drove home this morning while the sun was rising over the harbor, I thanked God that I had chosen the profession I did. I had fought a good fight and won. Think of it, Anne. Won against the great destroyer. It's what I dreamed of doing long ago when we talked together of what we wanted to do in life. That dream of mine came true this morning." "Was that the only one of your dreams that has come true?" asked Anne, who knew perfectly well what the substance of his answer would be, but wanted to hear it again. "You know, Anne girl," said Gilbert, smiling into her eyes. At that moment there were certainly two perfectly happy people sitting on the doorstep of a little white house on the Four Winds harbor shore. Presently Gilbert said with a change of tone, "Do I or do I not see a full-rigged ship sailing up our lane?" Anne looked and sprang up. "That must be either Miss Cornelia Bryant or Mrs. Moore coming to call," she said. "I'm going into the office, and if it is Miss Cornelia, I warn you that I'll eavesdrop," said Gilbert. "From all I've heard regarding Miss Cornelia, I conclude that her conversation will not be dull, to say the least." "It may be Mrs. Moore." "I don't think Mrs. Moore is built on those lines. I saw her working in her garden the other day, and though I was too far away to see clearly, I thought she was rather slender. She doesn't seem very socially inclined when she has never called on you yet, although she's your nearest neighbor." "She can't be like Mrs. Lynde after all, or curiosity would have brought her," said Anne. "This caller is, I think, Miss Cornelia." Miss Cornelia it was. Moreover, Miss Cornelia had not come to make any brief and fashionable wedding call. She had her work under her arm and a substantial parcel, and when Anne asked her to stay, she promptly took off her capacious sun hat, which had been held on her head, despite irreverent September breezes, by a tight elastic band under her hard little knob of fair hair. No hat pins for Miss Cornelia, an it please you. Elastic bands had been good enough for her mother, and they were good enough for her. She had a fresh, round, pink and white face and jolly brown eyes. She did not look in the least like the traditional old maid, and there was something in her expression which won Anne instantly. With her old instinctive quickness to discern kindred spirits, she knew she was going to like Miss Cornelia, in spite of uncertain oddities of opinion and certain oddities of attire. Nobody but Miss Cornelia would have come to make a call, arrayed in a striped blue and white apron and a wrapper of chocolate print, with a design of huge pink roses scattered over it. And nobody but Miss Cornelia could have looked dignified and suitably garbed in it. Had Miss Cornelia been entering a palace to call on a prince's bride, she would have been just as dignified and just as wholly mistress of the situation. She would have trailed her rose-spattered flounce over the marble floors just as unconcernedly, and she would have proceeded just as calmly to disabuse the mind of the princess of any idea that the possession of a mere man, be he prince or peasant, was anything to brag of. "I've brought my work, Mrs. Blythe, dearie," she remarked, unrolling some dainty material. "I'm in a hurry to get this done, and there isn't any time to lose." Anne looked in some surprise at the white garment spread over Miss Cornelia's ample lap. It was certainly a baby's dress, and it was most beautifully made, with tiny frills and tucks. Miss Cornelia adjusted her glasses and fell to embroidering with exquisite stitches. "This is for Mrs. Fred Proctor up at the Glen," she announced. "She's expecting her 8th baby any day now, and not a stitch has she ready for it. The other 7 have wore out all she made for the first, and she's never had time or strength or spirit to make any more. That woman is a martyr, Mrs. Blythe, believe me. When she married Fred Proctor, I knew how it would turn out. He was one of your wicked, fascinating men. After he got married he left off being fascinating and just kept on being wicked. He drinks and he neglects his family. Isn't that like a man? I don't know how Mrs. Proctor would ever keep her children decently clothed if her neighbors didn't help her out." As Anne was afterwards to learn, Miss Cornelia was the only neighbor who troubled herself much about the decency of the young Proctors. "When I heard this 8th baby was coming, I decided to make some things for it," Miss Cornelia went on. "This is the last, and I want to finish it today." "It's certainly very pretty," said Anne. "I'll get my sewing, and we'll have a little thimble party of 2. You're a beautiful sewer, Miss Bryant." "Yes, I'm the best sewer in these parts," said Miss Cornelia in a matter-of-fact tone. "I ought to be. Lord, I've done more of it than if I'd had 100 children of my own, believe me. I suppose I'm a fool to be putting hand embroidery on this dress for an 8th baby. But Lord, Mrs. Blythe, dearie, it isn't to blame for being the 8th. And I kind of wished it to have one real pretty dress, just as if it was wanted. Nobody's wanting the poor mite, so I put some extra fuss on its little things just on that account." "Any baby might be proud of that dress," said Anne, feeling still more strongly that she was going to like Miss Cornelia. "I suppose you've been thinking I was never coming to call on you," resumed Miss Cornelia. "But this is the harvest month, you know, and I've been busy, and a lot of extra hands hanging around eating more than they work, just like the men. I'd have come yesterday, but I went to Mrs. Roderick McAllister's funeral. At first I thought my head was aching so badly I couldn't enjoy myself if I did go. But she was 100 years old, and I'd always promised myself that I'd go to her funeral." "Was it a successful function?" asked Anne, noticing that the office door was ajar. "What's that? Oh, yes, it was a tremendous funeral. She had a very large connection. There was over 120 carriages in the procession. There was 1 or 2 funny things happened. I thought that die I would to see old Jaw Bradshaw, who is an infidel and never darkens the door of a church, singing 'Safe in the Arms of Jesus' with great gusto and fervor. He glories in singing. That's why he never misses a funeral. Poor Mrs. Bradshaw didn't look much like singing, all wore out slaving. Old Joe starts out once in a while to buy her a present and brings home some new kind of farm machinery. Isn't that like a man? But what else would you expect of a man who never goes to church, even a Methodist one? I was real thankful to see you and the young doctor in the Presbyterian church your first Sunday. No doctor for me who isn't a Presbyterian." "We were in the Methodist church last Sunday evening," said Anne wickedly. "Oh, I suppose Dr. Blythe has to go to the Methodist church once in a while, or he wouldn't get the Methodist practice." "We liked the sermon very much," declared Anne boldly, "and I thought the Methodist minister's prayer was one of the most beautiful I ever heard." "Oh, I've no doubt he can pray. I never heard anyone make more beautiful prayers than old Simon Bentley, who was always drunk, or hoping to be, and the drunker he was, the better he prayed." "The Methodist minister is very fine-looking," said Anne, for the benefit of the office door. "Yes, he's quite ornamental," agreed Miss Cornelia. "Oh, and very ladylike. And he thinks that every girl who looks at him falls in love with him, as if a Methodist minister wandering about like any Jew was such a prize. If you and the young doctor take my advice, you won't have much to do with the Methodists. My motto is, if you are a Presbyterian, be a Presbyterian." "Don't you think that Methodists go to heaven as well as Presbyterians?" asked Anne smilelessly. "That isn't for us to decide. It's in higher hands than ours," said Miss Cornelia solemnly. "But I ain't going to associate with them on earth, whatever I may have to do in heaven. This Methodist minister isn't married. The last one they had was, and his wife was the silliest, flightiest little thing I ever saw. I told her husband once that he should have waited till she was grown up before he married her. He said he wanted to have the training of her. Wasn't that like a man?" "It's rather hard to decide just when people are grown up," laughed Anne. "That's a true word, dearie. Some are grown up when they're born, and others ain't grown up when they're 80, believe me. That same Mrs. Roderick I was speaking of never grew up. She was as foolish when she was 100 as she was when she was 10. "Perhaps that was why she lived so long," suggested Anne. "Maybe 'twas. I'd rather live 50 sensible years than 100 foolish ones." "But just think what a dull world it would be if everyone was sensible," pleaded Anne. Miss Cornelia disdained any skirmish of flippant epigram. "Mrs. Roderick was a Milgrave, and the Milgraves never had much sense. Her nephew, Ebenezer Milgrave, used to be insane for years. He believed he was dead and used to rage at his wife because she wouldn't bury him. I'd 'a' done it." Miss Cornelia looked so grimly determined that Anne could almost see her with a spade in her hand. "Don't you know any good husbands, Miss Bryant?" "Oh, yes, lots of them over yonder," said Miss Cornelia, waving her hand through the open window towards the little graveyard of the church across the harbor. "But living, going about in the flesh?" persisted Anne. "Oh, there's a few, just to show that with God all things are possible," acknowledged Miss Cornelia reluctantly. "I don't deny that an odd man here and there, if he's caught young and trained up proper, and if his mother has spanked him well beforehand, may turn out a decent being. Your husband, now, isn't so bad, as men go from all I hear. I suppose," Miss Cornelia looked sharply at Anne over her glasses, "you think there's nobody like him in the world." "There isn't," said Anne promptly. "Ah, well, I heard another bride say that once," sighed Miss Cornelia. "Jenny Dean thought when she married that there wasn't anybody like her husband in the world, and she was right. There wasn't, and a good thing too, believe me. He led her an awful life, and he was courting his second wife while Jenny was dying. Wasn't that like a man? However, I hope your confidence will be better justified, dearie. The young doctor is taking real well. I was afraid at first he mightn't, for folks hereabouts have always thought old Dr. Dave the only doctor in the world. Dr. Dave hadn't much tact, to be sure. He was always talking of ropes and houses where someone had hanged himself. But folks forgot their hurt feelings when they had a pain in their stomachs. If he'd been a minister instead of a doctor, they'd never have forgiven him. Soul ache doesn't worry folks near as much as stomach ache. Seeing as we're both Presbyterians and no Methodists around, will you tell me your candid opinion of our minister?" "Well, really, well," hesitated Anne. Miss Cornelia nodded. "Exactly. I agree with you, dearie. We made a mistake when we called him. His face just looks like one of those long, narrow stones in the graveyard, doesn't it? Sacred to the memory ought to be written on his forehead. I shall never forget the first sermon he preached after he came. It was on the subject of everyone doing what they were best fitted for. A very good subject, of course, but such illustrations as he used. He said, if you had a cow and an apple tree, and if you tied the apple tree in your stable and planted the cow in your orchard with her legs up, how much milk would you get from the apple tree, or how many apples from the cow? Did you ever hear the like in your born days, dearie? I was so thankful there were no Methodists there that day. They'd never have been done hooting over it. But what I dislike most in him is his habit of agreeing with everybody, no matter what is said. If you said to him, 'You're a scoundrel,' he'd say with that smooth smile of his, 'Yes, that's so.' A minister should have more backbone. The long and the short of it is, I consider him a reverend jackass. But, of course, this is just between you and me. When there are Methodists in hearing, I praise him to the skies." Some folks think his wife dresses too gay, but I say when she has to live with a face like that she needs something to cheer her up. You'll never hear me condemning a woman for her dress. I'm only too thankful when her husband isn't too mean and miserly to allow it. Not that I bother much with dress myself. Women just dress to please the men, and I'd never stoop to that. I've had a real placid, comfortable life, dearie, and it's just because I never cared a cent what the men thought." "Why do you hate the men so, Miss Bryant?" "Lord, dearie, I don't hate them. They aren't worth it. I just sort of despise them. I think I'll like your husband if he keeps on as he has begun. But apart from him, about the only men in the world I've much use for are the old doctor and Captain Jim." "Captain Jim is certainly splendid," agreed Anne cordially. "Captain Jim is a good man, but he's kind of vexing in one way. You can't make him mad. I've tried for 20 years and he just keeps on being placid. It does sort of rile me. And I suppose the woman he should have married got a man who went into tantrums twice a day." "Who was she?" "Oh, I don't know, dearie. I never remember of Captain Jim making up to anybody. He was edging on old as far as my memory goes. He's 76, you know. I never heard any reason for his staying a bachelor, but there must be one, believe me. He sailed all his life till 5 years ago, and there's no corner of the earth he hasn't poked his nose into. He and Elizabeth Russell were great cronies all their lives, but they never had any notion of sweethearting. Elizabeth never married, though she had plenty of chances. She was a great beauty when she was young. The year the Prince of Wales came to the island she was visiting her uncle in Charlottetown, and he was a government official, and so she got invited to the great ball. She was the prettiest girl there, and the prince danced with her, and all the other women he didn't dance with were furious about it, because their social standing was higher than hers, and they said he shouldn't have passed them over. Elizabeth was always very proud of that dance. Mean folks said that was why she never married. She couldn't put up with an ordinary man after dancing with a prince. But that wasn't so. She told me the reason once. It was because she had such a temper that she was afraid she couldn't live peaceably with any man. She had an awful temper. She used to have to go upstairs and bite pieces out of her bureau to keep it down by times. But I told her that wasn't any reason for not marrying if she wanted to. There's no reason why we should let the men have a monopoly of temper, is there, Mrs. Blythe, dearie?" "I've a bit of a temper myself," sighed Anne. "It's well you have, dearie. You won't be half so likely to be trodden on, believe me. My, how that golden glow of yours is blooming. Your garden looks fine. Poor Elizabeth always took such care of it." "I love it," said Anne. "I'm glad it's so full of old-fashioned flowers. Speaking of gardening, we want to get a man to dig up that little lot beyond the fir grove and set it out with strawberry plants for us. Gilbert is so busy he will never get the time for it this fall. Do you know anyone we can get?" "Well, Henry Hammond up at the Glen goes out doing jobs like that. He'll do, maybe. He's always a heap more interested in his wages than in his work, just like a man, and he's so slow in the uptake that he stands still for 5 minutes before it dawns on him that he stopped. His father threw a stump at him when he was small. Nice gentle missile, wasn't it? So like a man. Course the boy never got over it. But he's the only one I can recommend at all. He painted my house for me last spring. It looks real nice now, don't you think?" Anne was saved by the clock striking 5. "Good Lord, is it that late?" exclaimed Miss Cornelia. "How time does slip by when you're enjoying yourself. Well, I must betake myself home." "No, indeed. You're going to stay and have tea with us," said Anne eagerly. "Are you asking me because you think you ought to, or because you really want to?" demanded Miss Cornelia. "Because I really want to." "Then I'll stay. You belong to the race that knows Joseph." "I know we're going to be friends," said Anne with the smile that only they of the household of faith ever saw. "Yes, we are, dearie. Thank goodness we can choose our friends. We have to take our relatives as they are and be thankful if there are no penitentiary birds among them. Not that I've many, none nearer than second cousins. I'm kind of a lonely soul, Mrs. Blythe." There was a wistful note in Miss Cornelia's voice. "I wish you would call me Anne," exclaimed Anne impulsively. "It would seem more homey. Everyone in Four Winds except my husband calls me Mrs. Blythe, and it makes me feel like a stranger. Do you know that your name is very near being the one I yearned after when I was a child? I hated Anne, and I called myself Cordelia in imagination." "I like Anne. It was my mother's name. Old-fashioned names are the best and sweetest, in my opinion. If you're going to get tea, you might send the young doctor to talk to me. He's been lying on the sofa in that office ever since I came, laughing fit to kill over what I've been saying." "How did you know?" cried Anne, too aghast at this instance of Miss Cornelia's uncanny prescience to make a polite denial. "I saw him sitting beside you when I came up the lane, and I know men's tricks," retorted Miss Cornelia. "There, I've finished my little dress, dearie, and the eighth baby can come as soon as it pleases." Chapter 9